She had been trained to believe Americans were monsters, but now, standing under a Texas sky, with a real rifle in her hands and the scent of leather and horses in the air, she didn't know what to believe any more. The rifle was heavy, not ceremonial, not broken, not a toy. A real weapon, oiled and warm from the sun. The American man who handed it to her didn't even look concerned. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, the kind she'd only seen in grainy enemy films, a cowboy. He tipped the hat once, said something in slow English she didn't understand, and gestured toward the line of empty cans. Then he smiled, not mockingly, just like he trusted her. Her fingers gripped the wood, uncertain. She could barely believe it. In Japan, even her own officers wouldn't have let a woman touch such a thing. And now the enemy was offering her a gun. A woman. A prisoner. Trusted. It wasn't freedom. Not yet. But it was something more dangerous. Respect. She shifted the weight of the rifle in her hands, unsure whether to hold it like a weapon or like a bomb that might go off at any moment. The sun had baked the wood, smooth and warm, the metal glinting just slightly under the cloudless Texas sky. Somewhere to her right, she heard the soft nicker of horses and the rhythmic creak of saddle leather as one of the Americans adjusted his stirrups. Wind stirred the dust around her boots. She tightened her grip instinctively, her fingers brushing the trigger guard, and the scent of gun oil rose to meet her nose, faint but unmistakable. It was real. The weapon was real, and they had handed it to her. A Japanese woman, a prisoner. She didn't dare look at the others, her fellow POWs standing just behind her in the shadow of the barn, but she could feel their eyes. She imagined their breath catching the same way hers had. For years she had been told the rifle was not hers to touch. Not as a woman, not as an auxiliary, and certainly not as a captive of war. Even when she'd bandaged soldiers who had been shot, cleaned wounds still seeping blood, she was never permitted to even glance too long at their weapons. That was a man's world, a soldier's world. She was to serve beside it, never within it. Now she was square in the middle of it. "Go on," the cowboy said gently. His accent stretched the words until they sounded like a lullaby and a dare all at once. He had been the one to hand her the rifle, holding it out like a loaf of bread instead of a threat. He wasn't in uniform, not exactly. His pants were canvas and worn at the knees, his boots caked with dust. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, sleeves rolled up, exposing sun-browned forearms. He didn't carry a sidearm. He didn't need to. Something about him, the way he stood, the ease of his posture, made it clear he was the one in charge, even without shouting. He tipped his hat again, just slightly. "You'll like it." She raised the rifle slowly, the way she had seen soldiers do years ago in training demonstrations. The stock nestled against her shoulder. Her muscles remembered something, even if they'd never done it before. She squinted down the barrel, heart thudding. A line of tin cans waited 20 paces away, dancing gently in the wind. She heard nothing but her own breath. Then, almost by instinct, she squeezed the trigger. The sound was sharp, immediate, and heavier than she expected. Her shoulder jolted. The can spun and clattered to the dirt. A cheer broke out behind her, not raucous, not mocking, just surprise, approval. She lowered the rifle slowly, her cheek tingling from where it had rested against the stock. She didn't smile, couldn't, not yet, but her body buzzed with something unfamiliar. Not power, not exactly. Recognition, maybe. A single shot, and the world had shifted slightly on its axis. Behind her another woman stepped forward hesitantly. The cowboy nodded and handed her a rifle too. No! Hesitation. No ceremony. Just trust, passed from calloused hand to cautious hand. It felt absurd. It felt dangerous. It felt liberating. She stepped back, rifle still in hand, and looked at the man again. He was watching the cans, not her, chewing absently on a piece of straw. There was no triumph in his face, no smugness, just quiet satisfaction, like a teacher seeing a student make the first correct stroke. That unsettled her more than if he had laughed. He wasn't testing her. He was treating her like she mattered, like she had the right to try. For a moment she thought of her commanding officer back in Manchuria, how he had once struck a fellow nurse across the face for offering unsolicited medical advice. She remembered the sound of the slap, the bright red welt, the silence that followed. That was the world she came from. Silence, obedience, fear. And now here she stood, the sun baking her neck, holding a rifle handed to her by a cowboy who trusted her not to turn it on him. Her mind raced. Was it a trick? A calculated move to disarm her with kindness? She had been trained to see the enemy as ruthless, clever, deceptive. But this didn't feel like deception. This felt like something far more dangerous. It felt like being seen. She clutched the rifle tighter, not ready to give it back. And as the next woman took her place at the firing line, she realized the gun was not the most dangerous thing in her hands. It was the idea, the possibility, that she was capable, that she was worthy of trust, that the person she had always been told to become, obedient, invisible, disposable, might not be who she had to remain. She stared at the tin can lying in the dirt, dented but still intact. One shot, one rifle, one cowboy, and suddenly the story she had lived by her whole life didn't make sense anymore. They hadn't expected to survive, let alone be put on a train and given windows to look out of. When they surrendered, it was with heads lowered and mouths closed, waiting for the gunshot that never came. There had been no trial, no parade of captors sneering in triumph. Just paperwork, canteens of water, and the faint smell of motor oil as they were loaded into open-air trucks. For days after, their hearts stayed clenched like fists, waiting for the moment when the kindness turned and the real punishment began. But it didn't. The train that carried them east rumbled slowly, cutting through the green veins of the American South. Heat pressed against the glass, but the windows were left cracked. They could breathe. That was the first surprise. The second was the landscape, open and endless. Hills like waves, fields without fences, and skies so wide they made you feel like a speck. America didn't feel like a country. It felt like an open mouth, exhaling something you couldn't name. Inside the car, the women sat in silence, backs straight, eyes guarded. They wore the remnants of their uniforms, skirts stained, sleeves rolled, buttons missing. Many hadn't bathed in weeks. Their faces were drawn not just from hunger, but from humiliation, because surrender wasn't a change in status. It was, according to everything they'd been taught, a permanent erasure of self. Bushido, the code that had followed them from childhood to war, had no chapter for captivity. To fall into enemy hands was not to lose a battle, it was to forfeit the right to live honorably. And so they rode through America like ghosts, believing themselves already dead in spirit. One woman clutched a strip of cloth from her family shrine. Another pressed a photo of her brother between her palms so tightly the corners cut her skin. They didn't speak unless they had to. Their mouths were filled with the ash of shame. But outside the train, the world refused to match the storm inside them. There were no bombed-out buildings, no screams, no children digging through ruins for bark to chew. There were barns with red roofs and cows grazing lazily. Men waved from pickup trucks. Women in cotton dresses hung laundry in their front yards. At one crossing, a boy on a bicycle pointed at them and grinned. He didn't throw anything. He just pedaled alongside the train for a moment, laughing. The music was the strangest thing. It came from everywhere and nowhere, snippets of blues from a roadside bar, the high twang of a fiddle near a crossroads, gospel voices floating from a clapboard church. None of it sounded like war. None of it sounded like the victors of a global campaign. It sounded like people living. When they were unloaded at the camp, if it could even be called that, the women tensed as one. The gates were wide but not rusted. The soldiers standing guard looked more like boys from a schoolyard than wardens. Their rifles were slung casually, not gripped tight. One man nodded. As they passed, not mocking, not smirking, just nodding as if acknowledging the arrival of guests, not enemies. That first night, as they lay on cots lined with clean blankets, some of the women whispered in disbelief, "Where are the dogs? Why haven't they shouted at us? Why do the guards look bored?" They weren't comforted by the absence of cruelty. It only deepened the mystery. Surely this was the prelude to something worse, a softening before the blow. But when the lights dimmed and the compound settled into an eerie stillness, no blow came. Just the steady sound of wind in the trees and, somewhere far off, the lonely cry of a train moving through the night. The enemy, it seemed, was not in a hurry to punish them. And in that pause, longer than anyone expected, something more terrifying than violence began to take root. Doubt. Because if America wasn't what they had been told, then what else might be a lie? The next morning, as the sun rose over the red dirt horizon, the gates opened wide, not to funnel them into labor under threat, but to simply let them walk. The guards waved them forward, gave clipped instructions in slow, awkward English, and pointed toward low wooden buildings with smoke curling from the chimneys. It wasn't a trick. The camp, if that's what this place truly was, didn't look like anything they had imagined. The fences were there, yes, and the towers, too, but the towers were unmanned, and the rifles slung over the shoulders of the guards hung there like afterthoughts. The path to the mess hall was lined with potted flowers, real ones. Someone had taken the time to plant them. The buildings looked like summer cabins, painted, sturdy, clean. Inside the hall, long tables were lined with plates, not tin bowls. There was the smell of something sweet, buttery. Cornbread, they would later learn. Cornbread and fried eggs and coffee so black it shimmered. One woman whispered that it smelled like food cooked for friends. There was even music playing, a low crackle from a dusty radio tucked on a shelf in the corner. Steel guitars and fiddles, a voice lilting about heartbreak and home. Country music, they would come to know it as. At first, they flinched at its unfamiliar rhythm, but something about the sorrow in the voice felt known. War-weary hearts recognized each other, even across enemy lines. After breakfast, they were not herded but asked if they would like to work. A translator, a Japanese-American soldier with careful eyes and a clipped accent, explained that there were fields to tend, tools to clean, barns to help with. No orders, just options. It made them suspicious. In Japan, requests were never really requests. There was always a consequence. But when one of the women shook her head and stepped back, the guard only nodded and moved on. No slap, no scream. Those who said yes were given gloves, straw hats, water. They were sent out under the wide, unforgiving sun, their boots crunching in dry earth. They pulled weeds. They raked feed into troughs for animals who watched them lazily with wide, indifferent eyes. One woman brushed a horse for the first time in her life. Another carried eggs in a basket from a coop. The work was real, but the atmosphere was something else entirely, calm, almost ordinary. In the afternoons, they were allowed to walk the perimeter paths, not the inner yard, but the roads that circled the fields where the fences stood but felt miles away. No one yelled at them for straying too close to the wire. No one dragged them back. A few guards rode horses nearby, their hats low, their attention half on the prisoners and half on the clouds. Some women sat beneath the trees and watched American boys play baseball, their shouts rising with laughter. The guards didn't chase them away. One even offered a spare ball. A few of the younger women passed it between them, stiffly at first, then with reluctant giggles. It was all so absurd, it felt like a hallucination. The strangest part of all was how the Americans looked at them. Not with hatred, not even with pity, but with something even more dangerous, indifference. They weren't monsters. They weren't captives to be broken. They were just people. When one of the older guards handed a woman a mug of lemonade after a long day in the fields, she stared at it as though it were a grenade. He only shrugged. "Hot out," he said. That was all. No lecture, no gloating. Just a simple truth. The sun was brutal, and thirst was real. It was in moments like that, small and unassuming, that the prison began to feel less like a sentence and more like a test. Not of loyalty or strength, but of identity. Who were they if they weren't hated? Who were they if they were useful or, even more confusing, liked? That night, as the Texas crickets sang under a moon too big to feel real, one woman traced the edge of her pillow and whispered, "This isn't a prison." No one answered, but no one disagreed. By the end of the week, the routines had started to feel like something close to normal, if such a word could exist in the shadow of war. Each morning, after a breakfast that still felt like a lie, a few women would gather by the main barn and wait to be assigned tasks. It wasn't mandatory. No roll call screamed at dawn, no threats hung in the air. Just quiet expectation and the knowledge that work, for now, meant something to do with their hands, their bodies, their time. And so they went. The ranch work was hard. Sun that bit at the back of the neck, dust that crawled into the eyes and ears, blisters forming under gloves, sweat soaking the backs of shirts. But there was something else underneath it all, something they hadn't felt in years. Purpose, not glory, not service to an emperor, just honest, repetitive labor that fed animals, cleared land, repaired fences. It didn't demand ideology. It just asked for effort. And the land, indifferent and vast, didn't care where they came from. She was assigned to the stables, brushing horses and raking straw. The animals were enormous, powerful, with eyes that studied her in silence. At first, she kept her distance, wary of the sudden movements and the unpredictable snorts. But the cowboys showed her how to stand, how to stroke the flank, how to read the flick of an ear or the swish of a tail. They did not bark orders. They demonstrated, nodded, and let her try. When she got it wrong, they didn't curse. One man, tall, lanky, with a face tanned like old leather, just grinned and said, "Ain't no one born knowing." That phrase echoed in her for days. No one in Japan had ever said such a thing to her. There you were expected to know, to obey, to act perfectly from the start. Shame was a blade always hovering, and mistakes were punishable, sometimes violently. Here, mistakes were just part of learning. She learned to rake hay in wide, even strokes. She learned to fix a broken latch with twine and patience. She even learned how to saddle a horse, though she had yet to ride one. The cowboys, some young enough to be her brother, others old enough to be her father, treated her not like a threat, not like a shameful thing to be hidden, but like someone useful. One day, after they'd mended a fence together under the boiling afternoon sun, the older cowboy with the hat perpetually tilted low handed her a canteen, then wiped his brow. "Ever shoot?" he asked casually. She blinked. The word caught her off guard. He gestured to the barn, where a few rifles were stacked beside an open crate of cans. "Reckon it's good for the hands. Builds steadiness." He didn't wait for an answer, just walked over, picked up a rifle, and motioned for her to follow. And she did. Not because she wanted to hold a gun, but because the offer had come with no strings, no edge, no coercion. Just like the work, an invitation. He showed her how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to breathe in and pause before the shot. She mimicked him, arms shaking slightly. When the crack rang out and the can jumped from the fence post, her breath caught. He clapped once, low and easy. "See? Told ya." It wasn't until she lowered the rifle that she realized the others had gathered behind her. Some looked confused, others curious. None seemed afraid. She handed the gun back and he waved her off. "Keep going if you like." She didn't. Not that day, but something shifted. Not because she'd fired a weapon, but because the enemy had trusted her with it. Trusted her not to run, not to turn, not to destroy, just to aim and shoot at a row of cans in the dirt. And for the first time in a very long time, she felt like someone who could be trusted. The can wobbled, then tumbled with a soft clink to the dirt. It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic, but the silence that followed held something weightier than the shot itself. The rifle's kick still echoed in her shoulder, not painful, but solid, like a door she'd never known was there had just been pushed open. Dust swirled around her boots, the gun still warm in her hands, and behind her she could feel it, the weight of eyes, her comrades watching, the guards watching. A line had been crossed, and yet the sky hadn't fallen. A few of the Americans clapped, short and easy, like they were encouraging a child's drawing or a successful toss at a county fair. She turned slowly, unsure of what to expect. Mockery, suspicion, scorn. But there was none. Just a few smiles, a couple of nods, approval, without arrogance. One of the younger cowboys gave her a thumbs up and winked. She didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but it made her heart flutter and her stomach turn all at once. She handed the rifle back with careful fingers. Her palms were slick with sweat, and her heart still pounded like a war drum. The moment hadn't lasted more than a minute, but it stretched inside her like a crack running through old concrete, silent, spreading. That night, in the barracks, the whispers began. "Did you see? They let her fire." No one stopped her. "They even clapped?" The words were half awe, half dread, because if this was real, if the Americans had truly handed over weapons without fear, it meant something unspoken had changed, not just in the guards, but in them. Someone asked aloud the question that had been stirring inside them all. Why would they let us shoot? There was no answer, only silence, broken by the creak of bed frames and the hum of insects outside the screen door. She lay on her cot, eyes fixed to the ceiling, replaying the moment again and again. The weight of the rifle, the breath she took before squeezing the trigger, the soft applause, and louder than any of it, the absence of punishment. It was impossible not to remember another moment. Years ago, a humid barracks room in Manchuria. She had spoken, nothing radical, nothing disobedient, just a suggestion during a medical drill. She had spoken to a superior officer without being addressed first. The slap had come so fast her head spun. Not a word of rebuke, just the flat crack of palm against cheek. And the message was clear. Know your place. But here, her voice had not just been heard, it had been answered. Her hands had held not shame, but steel. Her action had been met with praise. That reversal gnawed at the walls inside her. If this, too, was a lie, if trust could exist between captor and captive, if dignity could be given without rank, then what had she suffered for? What had they all believed in? The sound of the shot had not changed the world, but it had changed something more dangerous. The narrative, the internal one, the one that said, "You are a woman, and therefore less. You are a prisoner, and therefore powerless. You are Japanese, and therefore hated." The next morning, another woman asked to try the rifle, then another. The Americans didn't flinch. They lined up the cans again. They gave instructions, stepped back, and watched. No one tried to escape. No one turned the weapon around, because the weapon wasn't the point. The point was what it meant to be allowed to hold it, and what it meant to feel, if only for a breath, like the enemy trusted you with something dangerous, because maybe, just maybe, you weren't so dangerous after all. But there had been a time, not long before, when the idea of standing beside an American and holding a rifle would have been unthinkable, traitorous even. In that world, the one she had come from, trust was not offered. It was demanded. Obedience was not earned. It was enforced. She had been 16 when she joined the Women's Volunteer Nursing Corps. Her village had held a quiet ceremony. No flowers, no photographs, just a white armband and a bowed head from her father. The officer who trained them in Hiroshima told them they were the last line of the Emperor's defense. "You will not carry guns," he said. "You will carry duty." They learned how to stitch wounds, treat burns, silence screams, but more importantly, they were taught one lesson again and again. Surrender was dishonor. If captured, they were to die. If unable to die, they were to vanish. During training, they repeated this oath daily: to serve without shame, to die without hesitation. It was not metaphor, it was law. That law followed her into Manchuria. The hospital tents were hellish, mud floors, typhus, shattered limbs. She worked 12 hours a day, often more. Sometimes they didn't eat for an entire day. One winter, she lost a toenail from frostbite and kept working anyway. Her reward? A nod, a silence. She learned early that pain was invisible unless it slowed the mission. Her commanding officer once called her and 3 other nurses forward and berated them for crying after a young soldier died in surgery. "He dies with honor. You shame him with your weakness," he hissed. The next time someone died, they learned to blink their tears back until their eyes burned. She thought that was strength. She thought silence was dignity. When the American troops overran their outpost in the final weeks of the war, she was crouched behind a supply tent, trying to stop the bleeding from a soldier's thigh with her bare hands. He was screaming. Her commanding officer was gone, vanished without a word. The sounds of machine guns, boots in mud, shouted English. It all crashed around her like a rising tide. She closed her eyes and waited for the shot. Instead, someone grabbed her shoulder. Firm, but not cruel. She braced for a strike, but when she opened her eyes, it wasn't a rifle in her face. It was a young American, no older than the boy dying beside her, holding out a blanket. He didn't point. He didn't yell. He didn't shoot. He gave her the blanket. The soldier at her feet was dead. She didn't even realize it until then. She stared at the American like he was a hallucination. He motioned for her to stand. She hesitated. The blanket smelled like smoke and sweat. But it was warm. She rose slowly, heart pounding, eyes scanning for someone else, someone to bark orders, to accuse, to drag her away. But the American just turned and gestured her toward the others. A line of women, already gathering in silence. She expected shame. She expected to be spat on. She expected, at the very least, to be stripped of her dignity. Instead, she was given water. Instead, she was allowed to keep her name. In the weeks that followed, through holding cells and guarded transports, she braced for the punishment to begin. But the punishment never came. And now here she was, on the other side of the world, sun on her back, laughter nearby, with the memory of a world where mercy was weakness slowly unraveling in her mind. Back then she would have chosen death over capture. Now she wasn't so sure. There was a rhythm to life in the camp, and it no longer pulsed with fear. It moved with the pace of sunrises and calloused hands, of chores done before the heat peaked, of meals that came not as rations, but as routine. And at the center of it all were the men she still wasn't sure how to understand, these Americans with their battered boots, their dusty laughter, their strange way of treating prisoners like neighbors. They weren't soldiers. Not in the way she had known soldiers. They didn't bark commands or carry themselves with rigid, rehearsed fury. They weren't concerned with posture or ceremony. Some barely kept their shirts tucked in. Most chewed on wheat stalks and hummed while they worked. They called each other by nicknames, Slim, Red, Buck, and even teased one another in front of the prisoners. At first, she mistook it for sloppiness, a lack of discipline, but the more she watched, the more she saw the quiet current beneath it. They weren't lax. They were easy, loose where they could be, sharp when they needed to be. She saw one grab a rattlesnake with nothing but a shovel and a flick of the wrist, then joke about it 5 minutes later like it was a stray dog. But more than anything, she noticed how they treated the women. There were jokes, yes, but never lewd. There were orders, but they came with explanations. When one of the younger women fell ill from heat exhaustion, the cowboy nearby didn't shout or summon punishment. He picked her up, like a father would a child, and carried her straight to shade, fanning her with his hat and muttering something she didn't understand, but sounded like concern. One afternoon, while cleaning tack in the stable, her blisters split open again. The handle of the brush was rough, and the leather polish stung as it seeped into the cracks of her skin. She winced, tried to hide it, but the older cowboy, John, they called him, noticed. He said nothing at first, just squinted at her hands, nodded to himself, and walked off. She assumed he was gone for good. Maybe he'd send a reprimand. Maybe he'd pull her from the rotation. But 10 minutes later he returned. He tossed something at her feet. She looked down. Gloves, worn but clean. He said, "Don't be proud, they'll help." Then he walked away. She didn't thank him, not out loud. Her pride was still too intact for that. But she picked up the gloves, slid them on, and felt something in her chest give. Not break, just soften. Because in the world she came from, officers didn't give gloves. They gave orders. They gave backhands. They gave silence. The Japanese officers she had known had lived by a different code, a colder one. Rank was everything. Compassion was weakness. If you cried, you were a disgrace. If you hesitated, you were punished. She once watched a sergeant hit a nurse so hard her tooth came loose just for stepping out of line to help a wounded man who wasn't assigned to her. That nurse had apologized, not for being struck, for stepping out of line. But here, these cowboys, these strange, sunburned men with their songs and their soft eyes, they helped, they teased, they shook hands with each other, even after arguments. They treated women, even enemy women, like people. She didn't know what to make of it, but she knew how it made her feel. Less like a prisoner, more like a person. And in a world where names had been stripped and shame had been sewn into her skin, that small shift felt like something sacred. It was a Tuesday when the announcement came. They would be allowed to write home. The news traveled in ripples, soft but powerful, like wind through tall grass. At first, no one moved. The idea seemed absurd, like offering rain to people who had forgotten what clouds were. But the translator, the quiet Nisei soldier who always spoke with care, repeated himself, "One page. You may write to your families. It will be inspected, but it will be sent." The women sat for a long time before putting pen to paper. What could they say? What should they say? What version of the truth would reach home without being censored, or worse, misunderstood? Still, they wrote. One by one, they bent over their desks and opened wounds they hadn't touched in months. One woman wrote, "They let us shoot. Real rifles, not for war, but for sport. I hit a can." The American men clapped. Another wrote about the soap. "It lathers so much. It smells like something called lemon." Another, the one who had always been quietest, included a sketch of a horse she'd been caring for, shaded carefully with the edge of charcoal. Beneath it, she scrawled, "I named her Mizu. She has no idea we are enemies. The letters were sent, or so the Americans said, and in Japan the censors received them. Men in military offices read every word, every line, and they frowned, because these were not cries for help. They were not tales of abuse, starvation, humiliation. These were stories of dignity, of trust, of rifles handed freely, of music and cornbread and soft-spoken guards. At first, the reaction was silence, then panic. The women were not prisoners. They were becoming witnesses. Witnesses to a version of America that defied propaganda, that upended every nightmare fed to them through wartime broadcasts. The censors passed the letters higher. Debates raged behind closed doors. Should these women be punished, posthumously dishonored, even in absence? Could their stories unravel discipline at home? But the women did not know this. Not yet. Back in Texas, they returned to work. The letters were gone, like prayers cast into wind. But something had shifted again. A strange lightness clung to the camp. Women who had not spoken much began to hum while scrubbing boots. One of the younger girls, barely more than 15, asked a cowboy if she could try lassoing a fence post. He laughed and showed her how. She failed again and again, but never stopped smiling. And yet, beneath the joy, a shadow began to form. Because joy was not supposed to live here. Guilt crept in during quiet hours. As the sun went down and the cicadas began to sing, some women stared too long at the sky. They thought of home, of hunger, of the families who believed them to be suffering for the emperor. One night, the woman who had drawn the horse whispered, "What if they think we're traitors?" No one answered, but no one disagreed, because the truth was this: they were not in chains, they were not being broken, they were being seen. And that was more complicated than any punishment they had feared. Still, each day they woke up, pulled on their boots, and went to work. Because somehow, in the land they were taught to hate, they had found something gentler than victory. Permission to be human. If you've made it this far and you're enjoying the story, like the video and leave a comment below telling us where you're watching from. We read every single one. The mirror was nailed to the wall of the washroom, slightly cracked at the edge, its surface dulled from sun and years of steam. It wasn't special. It wasn't even clean, but that afternoon, after a long day in the fields, she paused in front of it and stared. Her reflection startled her. She was holding the rifle still, the one used for practice, leaning against her shoulder as if it belonged there. Her hands were wrapped in the American gloves, John's gloves, and her sleeves were rolled to the elbow, stained from saddle oil and dust. Her cheeks were ruddy from the sun, her skin no longer pale and hollow from hunger, but filled in, touched by color, and her eyes. They looked back at her with a question she couldn't answer. Who are you now? She used to know. A nurse, a daughter of Japan, a servant of the emperor, a shadow who moved quietly through war, expecting nothing but endurance and, eventually, death. But that woman no longer stood in the mirror. Now she saw someone else, someone who had laughed at a joke about chickens that morning, who had eaten peach cobbler from a dented tin plate, who had learned to whistle through her teeth while walking the fence line. She turned away. But the question followed her. That evening, by the fire pit, she sat beside another woman, Reiko, who had come from Osaka and never once cried since arriving. Reiko watched the smoke drift upward, then asked quietly, "If they gave you a gun and told you to fight for them, would you?" The words landed hard. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, "No." Reiko nodded. "Me neither." But the silence that followed was not certain, not confident, just heavy, because both of them knew the real terror wasn't in the rifle or the question. It was in the fact that if things continued like this, if the days stayed warm and the people stayed kind, one day maybe that answer might change. And if it did, what would that mean? Had they been re-educated, brainwashed, or had they simply been treated as human for the first time in too long? That night, as she lay awake, the thoughts gnawed at her. Was it betrayal to enjoy warmth? Was it treason to smile? Had Japan truly been broken, or had it broken her long before she ever crossed the sea? She remembered being told that dignity came from sacrifice, from enduring, from blind loyalty. But she had endured, and she had been loyal. And yet she had been spat on, struck, made to feel small. Here she was offered dignity not through obedience, but through trust. The rifle was never the point. The point was that it had been handed to her with no fear, that her hands, her judgment, her presence were accepted, not just tolerated. That was the moment she understood. Ideology had asked her to disappear, but dignity had asked her to be seen. And maybe that was the difference that mattered most. Not flags, not uniforms, but whether the world gave you permission to be fully alive. She rolled over on her cot, eyes wide open, and whispered to the ceiling, "I am still me." But the words felt different now, heavier, truer. And yet, somehow, stranger than ever. The day they left, the sun was barely up. The sky was pale and cloudless, the kind of quiet morning that made even the guards speak in hushed tones. The women were lined up outside the mess hall, bags in hand, dressed in civilian clothes the Americans had issued, simple cotton skirts, modest blouses, and sturdy boots with worn soles. Some held tightly folded letters, others a single keepsake, a book, a scarf, a carved horse figurine made from peachwood. She carried 3 things: a bundle wrapped in canvas, a Polaroid photograph, and a silence that had grown heavier with every passing mile between who she had been and who she had become. The cowboy who had handed her the rifle weeks ago was there at the gate. His hat was pulled low, his boots dusty. He didn't say much, just tipped his hat and said, "Take care, miss." She nodded. Words would have failed anyway. The truck rumbled to life. The gate opened. And just like that, the camp disappeared behind them. Fences, horses, music on the wind. As the train pulled east toward the coast, she looked down at the photograph again. She almost hadn't taken it. One of the younger American guards had snapped it after she hit 3 cans in a row at the rifle range. She had laughed, flushed with surprise, and he'd said, "You gotta keep this. Show 'em back home." Now The image felt like a relic from another lifetime. In the photo, she stood with the rifle slung across her shoulder, one eyebrow arched, a half-smile tugging at her lips. She looked strong, not because of the weapon, but because someone had seen her strength and let her carry it. Weeks later, when the boat finally docked in Yokohama, the air was thick with smoke and the scent of rotting seaweed. The port was in ruins, twisted metal, cracked concrete, the distant sound of coughing. Women stepped off the ship with slow, careful feet. No one met them with banners or relief, only a clipboard, a board official checking names. She stepped onto Japanese soil and felt the weight of a silence far louder than anything she'd heard in America. Her village had changed. The shrine was gone. Her childhood home, roof sagging, windows shattered, stood like a ghost. Her father had died during an air raid. Her mother was living with cousins inland. When she arrived, her mother stared at her boots before embracing her. No one asked what had happened in America. No one wanted to know. She unpacked in silence. The photo she hid beneath her sleeping mat. The boots she wore every day. The bundle of letters she tied with twine and placed in a box beneath the stove. Sometimes, in the dead of night, she would take the photo out. Not to remember the camp, not to remember the rifle, but to remember who she had become when someone finally trusted her with something more powerful than a weapon, a choice. She was not proud. Pride had nothing to do with survival. But she was alive, and she intended to stay that way. If this story moved you, like the video and comment below where you're watching from, these forgotten stories matter, and your voice helps keep them alive.